Jeremy Smithson, founder and recovering CEO, I'll let him explain what that means, of Puget Sound Solar, is going to be the man leading the charge on this next panel, which we're very excited about. Power storage, return on investment, when, where, why. If you need a shot of caffeine, this is the group that's going to do it for you. Put your hands together for this panel. Thank you very much.
So it'll take a couple of minutes for people outside the curtain to hear the booming voice back here and wander in. But first, I just want to say that it's an honor and a pleasure to be moderating what I would call a gigawatt class panel. There is such depth and breadth of knowledge sitting on the stage here. I could spend a couple of days with them and still have a lot to go. But we're going to try to focus on the topic at hand. And I'm going to let each one introduce themselves, starting with Eduardo.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jeremy. So my name is Eduardo Guerra. I'm leading the digital solution for UL Solutions. I've been in the energy business for the last 20 years doing project development and now leading the sales side, the business development for UL Solutions.
Dan Gerard, Alternative Power Generation. We basically are an EPC company. First energy storage we installed was in 2006.
I'm Kevin White. I'm with Exponent. It's a science and engineering consulting firm. And for better or worse, I've been attached to the lithium-ion battery industry from the beginning of my career. I'm here to support questions about safety, reliability, and performance. And I hope you all reach out and ask lots of good ones.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Darren. I'm with Cruise. We're an autonomous vehicle company, but our entire fleet is electric. So we have the fun job of figuring out how to keep these vehicles charged and operating. That's my team's role, previously at Tesla and other parts of the energy industry.
Excellent, thank you. And Matt Kiso, Director of Strategic Product Incubation and IoT Solutions with Open Access Technology, bringing the utility perspective and the software technology and protocols.
All right, so that really doesn't touch on what all these people know, so I do invite you to read their bios on the website. So we're going to try to jump into this and run through a bunch of questions regarding the return on investment for battery storage. It's a hot topic now. There's a lot of money headed this way, and so we're going to discuss, is that enough, or where's that money going? And so I'm going to start with this question. How is battery energy storage being used to support EV charging today, and how does this mitigate grid costs? Who wants to jump in? Darren's holding his mic up.
I think he was targeting me on this one. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, Cruise has an all-electric vehicle fleet, and it's quite large. We actually have several hundred vehicles in operation today in our 3 markets of San Francisco, Phoenix, and Austin. And as I'm sure you guys have heard multiple times today already, one of the biggest problems for charging is getting the power to your sites. So when we think about ROI for power storage, mostly batteries, we think about how we're getting stopgap charging to our sites. Happy to dive into this in more detail, but we try to think about it in terms of use cases, right? There are going to be some sites where you do have grid power, and almost every single time, grid power is the cheapest, most reliable form of electricity, and you should just go with that. But there are some sites that you don't have enough power for your charging needs. That's where we have to look at alternative solutions. Some of these subsets include sites with remnant power, maybe power that is not at 480 volts, but at 208 volts or 240 volts. And in those cases, you can use interesting battery-backed charging solutions. One company I want to give a brief shout out to is FreeWire, as some of you folks are nodding in the audience. And we find them very useful for some of our sites with remnant power. There are other sites with no remnant power at all, 0 power. So you have to get the power in there somewhere. For that, we rely on maybe mobile battery trailers, people who are literally transporting charged batteries to your site so they can refuel you. That sounds really inefficient, but there are actually some companies doing interesting work in the space that is helpful for us for standing up charging. And for that, I'll give another shout out to a company you'll see in the expo hall here, Spark Charge. Encourage you all to take a look at these companies.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to the ROI side on the storage. A lot of times with the utilities, they're very engaged and interested in adding battery storage to their distribution network as well. So in some cases, it actually, by engaging with the utility, bringing them in a few of our microgrid deployments we've done, the utility is actually the one funding the battery to upsize that energy storage and use it as a distributed energy resource. So there's not only the layer of charging the vehicles, but also keep in mind that next layer up, or that next off-taker, being the utility or a microgrid operator.
Yeah, I just want to add something else here. We're talking about return on investment, right? And you have to protect your return by protecting your investment. When you're deploying these big battery packs into different parts of the planet eventually, right? But we can talk about the United States. I mean, Wyoming has been brought up a few times. The environmental conditions in a remote state like that are really, really tough on battery packs. And that really hasn't been part of the discussion yet, right? It's a situation where we're going to be putting a lot of electrical energy stored as chemistry out in a field somewhere. And if we don't really think very carefully about how to protect that asset, it's going to take all of your returns and erase them. Because you're going to be wrapped up with lawyers and people who are very upset that the battery pack that's in their backyard just caught on fire. So understanding the requirements of a lithium-ion battery is something that really needs to creep into this community. When put together correctly, they're very, very safe. I mean, there's billions of them in use in the world right now, and we only hear about the ones that misbehave themselves. So there is a way to critically think about how to protect that battery from the wind, the dust, the ice, the snow, whatever the conditions are. And it really has to become part of the thought process when we're thinking about deploying these batteries into remote locations.
I'll add a little bit. Same type of thought pattern. No, when you actually put in chargers, and you got a lot of EV charging going on, your demand charge will be driven up from the utility. So if you actually add energy storage and you can smooth some of that out, arbitrage it over time, it helps your cost to go down. And then I'll second the thought that the utilities want it also, because they do not want this large demand at one location where it's basically on and off all day long.
That's absolutely right. And as you can hear, there are many questions, right? Where to deploy this type of assets, how it's going to be utilized, how it's going to be impacting your load profile and your cost, right? Is it available? Can I implement this type of assets anywhere? Or we'll need to see the hosting capacity available so the utility will feel safe to operate this type of assets. So what becomes important is to, before deploying these assets, evaluate how they're going to behave, right, through modeling, for example. And that's one of the solutions that we are providing through digital solution, is to investigate and provide those type of insights, right? How you can right-size your number of charges, for example, as you were saying, in residential or commercial buildings, in such a way that would meet the utility capacity available, and how you can expand that through energy storage systems. Right? So that becomes important to understand how the integration of those different assets would interact and the impact on the techno-economic analysis as well.
Can I just mention, Dan, you mentioned that the utilities might want you to deploy batteries at your end use. I'll just say it would really help the ROI if the utility would pay us to do that.
Oh, yeah. Agree.
And we have seen some utilities and cooperatives that are getting more open and understanding the value and the ROI to them being able to dispatch those batteries. So I think more and more of those programs will become available where it's not quite a PPA, it's a cost share type program. The utility or the site owner will still own the battery, but by gaining access and having the contract to dispatch that, I think there's going to be a lot of funding opening up in the utilities for that.
So I'm hearing that it's a pretty complex issue, that, as far as the return on investment, you can look at it from different aspects. So obviously there's, on the utility side, you're going to reduce loads, by instantaneous loads anyway. On the customer side, you're going to reduce demand charges maybe. And there are different situations for, like say fleet versus public charging. Do we have the technology to meet all of those challenges, or what is left that we haven't done to meet those challenges?
I would say the cost is still not there.
Cost?
I mean, yeah, the cost is still not there. I mean, the examples that I just mentioned are how to bring stopgap charging to sites that don't have it. Frankly, those costs are like 5 to 10 times what it takes to get power directly from the grid. So anyone who says, hey, we're going to power this all with solar and batteries and you'll be fine, at the moment, that is almost guaranteed not to be true. And because of that, you're still dependent on the grid and the utility timelines. One thing that would be neat is if there is some model where the utility could say, hey, I'd rather you install this battery so I don't have to go through all the permitting and all the expenses and so on, and find some way to share that value. All of a sudden, that would make this a lot more intriguing.
Yeah. Do we have any utility people in the audience? What? Oh my God. That's
Next year.
sad. Okay, so
Well, that's interesting because I used to work for the utility, and from their perspective, they're trying to adapt and innovate on that end. And I'm from the Northeast, and on that area, they are developing those type of programs that will facilitate the acceleration of those type of make-ready infrastructure. How you can deploy fast that infrastructure in specific areas paid by the utilities, right? Now, the thing is the business case behind it, right? What are the motivators to do that type of investment? What will be the business case behind it in such a way that it will be a win-win for the utility and for the business developer and the users as well?
yeah, in our state, the investor-owned utilities could rate base, those kinds of projects if they get approval to do it. So, there is a case there. On the customer side, where's the customer to get that money? Is the savings on the operating and maintenance costs of the electric vehicles going to help mitigate some of the costs for putting in the infrastructure? Does anybody look at it that way?
I think EVs are still upfront more expensive than the combustion equivalent, but maybe those savings in terms of maintenance and so on can be amortized to think about it more holistically from your energy infrastructure. I should also clarify what I said before. It's not that batteries are not economical when tied to the grid. Like, as multiple people have mentioned, you can actually save money by installing batteries and arbitraging either demand charges or energy charges. I think the issue is if you expect to have fully powering your site with batteries in a short amount of time, there's no cheap way to do that.
I'll add to what Darren just said. If you're looking at a fleet, so you're charging a fleet, you really don't want all of your vehicles to start charging exactly at the same time. So you're looking at like a microgrid controller that basically controls when everything starts charging. And then energy storage comes in, because if you've got a large energy storage tied to those vehicles, you can basically say, okay, we're going to control that demand charge, and we're going to also help the utility at the same time. That's why there is a demand charge. They want you to lower that demand. And basically, that is normally 40% of your total bill. So you really want to control that charge. So you do it by charging the vehicles basically in series, but you have to have them all out at the same time. So you basically look at it and say, the battery's going to help me here. I'm going to charge it up before the vehicles come in, or I'm going to charge it up with renewables. And then basically, when it comes in, you discharge and you base them out so that they're not all operating exactly at the same time.
You're certainly right, Dan, and that's very important. What you mentioned is that these two types of charging infrastructure, one that would be on demand, So whenever you go to the charging station, you connect and you need instant power. But in certain facilities, for example, your office building or supermarket or retail, in which you know that you're going to be parked there for a period of time, let's say an office building, you're going to be there like for 8 hours. It doesn't make sense to charge at the beginning of the day just when you get there. And that's when we call it, it's a deferrable load, in which you need an infrastructure, a software, a platform called DERMS, Distributed Energy Resource Management System, that would allow that type of deferrable load for the most economical or the most cost-effective way to recharge your fleet. And those are the type of things that it's important to analyze before you enter into a development program and understand the interactions between the tariff, the load, and the patterns that you see based on the vehicles that are getting connected at those infrastructure.
Yeah, OATI operates the largest deployments of distributed energy resource management systems, so thank you for that setup there. But the utilities are becoming very, very excited and very, very aggressive with their rebates and their incentives and the programs they're offering through those DERMS programs. So as site operators, fleet operators, looking at adding that battery, there could be a large ROI coming back from the utility. And they don't even need to call it. You can use it to smooth your load locally, and they might only call that event once a month or once a year, but they're still going to pay you monthly to have access to that battery. So the more and more batteries that are deployed in their territory, they could defer building an entire gas peaker plant, and that saves them millions. They don't need to bake that into the rate case. So surprisingly, they're getting these programs through their public utility commissions very easily, because they're saying either we have to build a gas turbine plant or we can distribute a bunch of these batteries and incentivize our members to join that program.
Matt, that's pretty interesting. I mean, I've heard of the Green Mountain Power program, and I'm sure there are others out there where homeowners pay very little for, say, a Tesla Powerwall, as long as they let the utility manage that battery to support the grid. Are you aware of any programs where that's being used for commercial or fleet customers?
Fleet customers, there's some newer programs, and I think going back to the technology question, is the technology there? I was going to add, I think all the technology, all the lithium-ion batteries, they're safe now. Everybody's adopting them. I think it is more the rates. They're tied up in PUCs. They're tied up in the commercial agreements, the legal process of it, the political side of bringing these batteries into their system and knowing how it's going to impact their rates, because they haven't seen it, they don't know how to operate it, so they're kind of guessing at the numbers they're offering in the first few years. So we've seen a few pilot programs, but nothing on large scale, more so in residential, but not much in large scale commercial yet. As buses become more prevalent, I think the EV buses are going to be a huge one for that. Battery on wheels, that's parked most of the time, so I think more and more will come out there, but they're still maturing or kind of in pilot proof of concept phase for sure.
So Matt touched on something pretty important, and when he said that he was talking about getting the batteries out there. The problem right now is one of supply and demand. Right, there's not enough demand for these things, so manufacturers aren't making them, so they cost a bunch. Right, so it's a sort of a chicken and egg problem, and we saw this with the automotive industry as well. Right, there wasn't an early adoption of big batteries for electric cars, but it got incentivized and people started getting on board. And now the price per kilowatt hour of an automotive battery has dropped by 25 or 30% just over the last 5 to 6 years. So if the adoption happens, that same sort of trend is likely to happen in the distributed power regime as well.
I've got a related question that's not on our list, but you just made me think of it. How is the Inflation Reduction Act requirements going to affect the market in the next couple of years? Are we going to meet that challenge with manufacturing in the U.S.? Can we scale up?
There's a really big push right now to build billion-dollar battery plants in the United States. And Georgia and North Carolina have the first two coming online, one from LG Energy Systems and one from SKI. solely to serve the automotive industry. But the important thing here is bringing those onshore and building that stuff here in the United States is going to help with the adoption. It's going to erase some of the not from overseas, I want my products from the US, which is going to help. The other really interesting thing to realize is the batteries that go into electric vehicles right now are essentially the same things that go into batteries that power ESS systems, for example. Right? So there's going to be a crossover in the manufacturing space where there can be a production run for automotive, and that same line could turn around and start making cells for storage systems, which is going to help with the price. Right? So it's a synergistic relationship that we cross our fingers, hopes happens and starts to bring prices down.
One other incentive that's happened recently is originally to put energy storage in, you had to be tied to PV to get the best rebate back. Now they stand alone. You can charge that battery in different ways, different functions. One item about a battery that a lot of people don't realize, it can be a load or it can be generation. So you can use that to smooth everything out by taking that battery and charging it at off times and then discharge it during the peak times. But with it, the new IRA, I think, is going to drive a lot of demand, might actually overdrive the demand, but I think it's going to drive a lot of demand.
Definitely. And very quickly, I would like to add as well that from UL Solutions perspective, we are advising different government states in how to basically providing advice related to the different grants and potential ways to implement those grants that have been approved already in the Inflation Reduction Act and the bilateral infrastructure law as well. So basically, all the details are not clear yet in how it would be deployed, but those would come very soon. On the other side, related to the batteries, definitely bringing the manufacturing here, it would accelerate the adoption as well as the cost competitiveness. Now, one of the problems that we're seeing is that because we are ramping up both sides, stationary energy storage system and mobility through electric vehicles, we have this competition. And today, it brings more return to utilize the batteries in a vehicle compared to a stationary system. But that brings another opportunity, how to reutilize those depleted batteries from the electric vehicle fleets into stationary. That is something that has been in discussion, and there are a few companies that they start investigating that option as well. And now the big important part is it needs to be safe, right? I mean, how you will repackage and recertify those batteries in such a way that it would not be a problem down the road.
Yeah, and I think on the Infrastructure Act and all the grant funding coming out, I think that's really helping with bringing things back to America here, building out more of the infrastructure here. But we also see it from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on the operations side. They've released FERC Order 2222, which allows different their pricing nodes throughout the North American network. They've lowered that now from 1 megawatt down to 100 kilowatt hour. So they enable more batteries being sold into the markets and for utilities to operate with them. So we're seeing it from the initial acts coming in, but then also them pushing for the longer term operational value on those batteries on the grid with some of those FERC orders.
Well, Matt, you just segued into another question. So personally, I've been watching West Coast day-ahead electricity prices for a number of years now. And the last couple of years, I've noticed an increase and a lot of volatility. So is that an opportunity now for introducing more battery storage?
I think absolutely. I think that's why the utilities are starting to look at more battery storage, look at more microgrid deployments, understand how to get this previously one-way network of large power generation out to distribution endpoints and mix that with some midline storage, end-of-line storage, and be able to support that, because that's exactly what they're seeing too, is they're looking at those prices as solar's coming in as other things are happening on the grid and more electrification of transportation is happening. So they're really trying to figure out how do they control their costs in those markets as well. And that's what they're seeing is that volatility is just what stuff they've never seen before, and price peaks in the market that haven't been seen ever before. So
Yeah, factors that have been, amplified by climate change have really kind of come in a big way.
They're driving the adoption of really big solar farms with really big battery energy storage systems in the western United States. There's reliable sunshine all the time, and what the utilities are really realizing is that they can charge up these ginormous batteries during the day when the sun is shining and keep that energy in the battery pack until it's needed. When instead of having rolling brownouts, they turn on the big battery instead and keep their customer base happy. That same concept can be used for distributed EV charging. If you're on I-80 in the middle of Wyoming and you've got nothing but land and sunshine, why not put up a big solar farm and put a honking big battery on there that's capable of charging a few hundred cars a day, which unfortunately is all you probably would need on I-80 in Wyoming. But
Yeah, and just to add on that, I think this morning someone was talking about the infrastructure. What do we have today in terms of transmission and distribution? And I think that one of the big limiting factors to implement more renewables in rich resource areas, like they have abundant solar irradiance or wind patterns that could justify the investment, but they have this limitation. From the utility perspective, the queue for interconnection has been astronomical. And because of that, less renewable power has been implemented, which brings the big opportunity to deploy more energy storage. And we can capture or limit the interconnection and utilize and store that unused resource for the long, well, at least for the short period of time, and shift the peaks. One of the things that Matt was mentioning as well is the grid edge innovation that was happening right now at the utility level. I was fortunate enough to participate in one of the non-wires alternatives in the Northeast, and how important it is to just reduce the 1% peak or the 10% peak that is being utilized less than 5% of the year is justifying all the infrastructure laid out on the distribution side. And with that, we can avoid, we were able to avoid a new substation build-up that would have cost $1.2 billion just by reducing the peak during the summer. And that could be achieved through multiple measures, right? Through a demand response, energy efficiency, but the most effective and more cleaner would be energy storage. So you can effectively dispatch that renewable power.
So you can hear some of those ROI numbers. If a new substation is in the billions and they could give a rebate of $50,000 to every person who deploys X size battery that gives them dispatchable, that's a lot of batteries they could get deployed. So I think the utilities have the budget. They just need to become more comfortable with allocating that budget to the newer energy storage programs, ensuring they're going to be on so that they don't get tied up in the litigation for years and get their money back. But those are the types of dollars and 5-year, 10-year plans the utilities are trying to manage. So the quicker they can get it out there and defer, either not do or defer that substation build out or an upgrade on the wires, it's a huge cost for them. So there's, I think, going to be, as more and more become understood and comfortable within proposing those programs, they're going to be able to free up a lot of that capital for these types of deployments.
Yeah, I think the non-wire solutions is out there. When you really look at non-wire solutions, Queens, New York was an area that they looked at 12 days per year in which they were going to have to build generation for. They basically looked and said, what non-wire solutions can we get? You can ask people to incentivize them, right? Like, please turn up your air conditioner. After day 3, that air conditioner is going down. You're going to cool that house. However, energy storage is a very good solution for that type of area.
That kind of leads into another question, which is, we'll get into the weeds a little bit here. What would be the difference between battery storage for a public charging installation versus a fleet charging installation?
Yeah, I mean, the big difference is that the energy density of the battery, right? So if you take a look at, I'll use FreeWire as an example, right? It's got I believe, 160 kilowatt hour battery in it. And that is very useful if you give it time to recharge and then pump out at full speed for the next customer that arrives. But if you're going back to back to back on it all day long, that's not going to cut it, because at some point you're going to completely consume the battery capacity, and then you're stuck with the lower AC kilowatt connection, which was an advantage before, but now is kind of a limiting factor. So there's a time and place for when you use battery storage. This is why FreeWire has been focused on convenience stores, gas stations, where it's more of a public charging perspective. For us, on the fleet use case, we still find it useful because of that stopgap power challenge that we face. We have sites with remnant power, and it's better to have some charge sessions, even if we can't pump it back to back to back. But I just acknowledge that cruise might be a bit of a unique use case. We do want to keep our vehicles on the road as much as possible. If you are say a bus fleet or a last mile delivery fleet, you probably have much less stringent schedules and are able to manage that, do smart charging, do battery DERMs, and so on.
So on fleet, most places are very predictable. If I'm running a fleet of vehicles, I know when they're coming in, I know when they're going out. However, when you got public charging, you got a big fluctuation in there. Fleets, in my opinion, is a lot easier to predict. It's a lot easier to understand. It's probably where a lot of energy storage belongs.
Right, and what I would like to add is once again, the importance of the resiliency, right? What happens if we have an outage? The battery, if it's not connected to a generation source, such as solar photovoltaic, it would have a limited life, right, in terms of power. So it becomes important to understand the interactions between the charging infrastructure, the use of that infrastructure, and how you are keeping that cycle going. We recently did a study in one hospital in which one of the requirements was to transition the fleet of ambulance from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, right? So that would be connected to the grid, but what happens if the grid goes out, they said? I mean, we at least need to have 2 ambulances to operate, I don't know, X number of trips per day. And based on those requirements, you start building out and the resources, right, the location, geographical location. It will tell you how much irradiance and how much power you would be able to generate throughout the year or through the days that would satisfy the requirement that they have. So I would like to mention again the importance on understanding the problem and how to evaluate it so to fully take the right decisions, right?
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the nose. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for any of the problems that we're talking about. I think it's going to come down to a combination of battery, grid, wind, solar, whatever we can think of that provides a solution for that specific facility or that specific situation. It turns into a fun engineering problem. The cool thing is we have to realize that we have the building blocks to do this and use those building blocks in a safe and meaningful way. Right? We shouldn't go into it headlong. We should think very critically about the engineering space that we have to work in when we're deploying these mixed systems and make sure there's system synergy between all the different parts.
And I think you brought up a good point, Eduardo. The different off-takers too. The hospital has a specific use case. The different, public works facilities. We're talking to a fire department and a police station where the city-owned utility is looking to make their city more resilient to power outages because of their distribution system setup. And so they partnered up with the city and the police and the fire to say, let's put in a battery here, we'll cost share, deploy that as a dispatchable asset, but then to the citizens and to help with taxpayers, it's all resilient for their critical infrastructure and being able to have a place people could go to, or their first responders still being able to get to their vehicles and get out.
Yeah, I think what you're getting to is what is the use case? What is the driving mission for it? And in some cases, the value is mission criticality, right? It's to make sure you have that resilience. And I guess someone can go and figure out what is that value of resilience. I think that's something that a lot of people can struggle to figure out. We have struggled to figure that out in Cruise. There's the other potential value add, which is just literally ROI, which I know is the subject of this panel. But as we've discussed, there are situations where it does make sense, and there are situations where it doesn't. So back when I was at Tesla, we evaluated, should we put mega packs with our supercharger stations? And it turns out a very small percentage of supercharger stations actually benefited from that for exactly the reason that you mentioned, Dan. It's super unpredictable when private drivers are going to arrive, and you can't time the battery consumption and dispatch very well. That being said, the same time we went through that, Electrify America was buying all of Tesla's power packs to deploy on sites. And we're like, why is that happening? How is that possible? Our suspicion, and I don't want to speak for them, is that they have a certain budget that they have to spend. And they were willing to go and spend that and make sure they had a lower OPEX in the future. And then the last piece is Cruise's use case, which is we literally just need charging. So...
Well, this kind of leads into maybe what might be our last question before we go to Q&A. So we're talking about return on investment, and we have a question about amortization. And in this day of rising interest rates, that question gets a little more prickly, and it makes me wonder, are utilities going to be better able to amortize these things than commercial entities? And is it going to drive this market toward utilities? Or, I mean, that's my own question on top of the question, how are we amortizing these things now and in the future?
So I think utilities are exploring this right now with the energy storage systems that they've already got deployed, right? And they're learning right now. I mean, the lithium-ion battery industry is only 26 years old. Right. It's not and it's continuously evolving as well. I mean, there's new research coming in, so it's a moving target. And I think the utilities are really using kind of using the BESS system as an anchor point because it makes the most sense for them right now. So I think what we're going to see happening is the utilities are going to start figuring out where the pitfalls are in deploying these really big batteries when they can do it in a really controlled fashion, when they're hooking it up to their grid and their engineers are working on it. They're going to learn what they have to do to make it possible for someone in this room to buy one of those batteries and deploy it somewhere so it's going to enter and have it interact in the right way with their grid. We'll leave it to the rest of you guys for comments.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Kevin. But I would like to add one more thing. So we cannot put all that load into the utility side, but also on the market, right? When we need market adaptation, market innovation, how we can allow developers on the commercial side as well to provide benefits to the utilities and to the market, creating a business case that would incentivize the adoption and acceleration of this type of assets in such a way that would be a win-win situation for the public and for the private sector. I think that's important as well, and in order to do that, I will state once again that it's important to understand the interactions between the generation, between the demand, so basically you'll need to model these type of situations in order to really understand what's needed, what needs to be true for this to happen. If it is an incentive, it will be a tax credit, or it would be just a new market that would open up for these type of assets.
The one thing we face with a lot of our clients is they ask, so the price of the batteries are coming down. And most of the time they are. And then they say, should I buy a 15-year battery? And you're like, well, should you buy a 7-year battery, basically evergreen it, which means add more batteries to it, or replace it after 7 years? It's really a cost factor. You got to look at it and basically make a judgment. Now, on the ROI side, we've had clients come to us and say, I want to prove a battery on an ROI. And then you get talking and you get going through the situation, they go, but I need to be able to island. Well, the minute you say you're going to island, you got to go basically to a battery, which basically approves all the ROI, because if I'm going to do an island, I got to be able to do that. Or I got to put a generator in, which most people don't want to do anymore. So on the ROI side, a lot of times it's driven by the multiple steps that a battery can do.
Still have a few more minutes before Q&A. Is there a big breakthrough that's going to really improve return on investment?
From a battery science standpoint, no. There will be no paradigm shift in the near future. We've pretty much exhausted the periodic table. There's some really interesting chemistry that's coming online right now, but it's really still in the development phase. I mean, you hear a lot about solid-state batteries or lithium metal anode batteries. They exist, and they work, but they're not ready for prime time yet. So we're kind of in a waiting game for these new chemistries to come online and provide that paradigm shift that we're looking for. But in the near term, we're not going to see anything big happen. We're going to get lots of gains from better manufacturing, and we're going to get a break on price by onshoring this stuff.
So scale.
Yeah. Incremental advances in the near term, and it's going to be a while before we see paradigm shifts again.
Well, Kevin, I got a question. Do you think that lithium ion has to be what's used for ESS for, say, charging sites, though? I think Eduardo mentioned that you're kind of competing against the vehicular batteries here. But you could have less energy dense batteries potentially for the ESS use case. Have you seen that happening?
Well, I mean, the first ESS systems were lead acid, and a lot of those are still running. I mean, it's not a very sexy chemistry, but it works really, really well. And you got to have a whole bunch of real estate to put one up. And that's the attractive side of lithium ion. I mean, they're, I think, 30% more energy dense than anything else out there, at least 30% more energy dense than anything else out there. So we're talking about a reduction in the size of the facility you have to build for the same number of electrons. So yeah, there are other solutions, but they may not be viable.
Let's make them taller.
Yeah.
I'd say it's the breakthrough is probably more in just comfort and adoption as utilities become more, they learn their big grid scale deployments, trying to figure out, and then being able to articulate that to their PUCs or their ratepayers of this is why this is valuable. And I think those opening up different markets, opening it up for EPCs to deploy these and see the value in the ongoing payments from the utilities. I think it's going to be more so in that as people become more comfortable, the technology's there, but it's setting up the commercial terms and the business agreements and being comfortable in that sense. I think that'll be the next hurdle, and the next, we'll be looking back like, why were we worried about it? But I think that's going to be the next breakthrough.
I think one of the biggest things you see is people applying batteries in the wrong way. So what I mean by that is if they need it for 6 hours, and they think, well, I'm going to put a 4-hour battery in, then when you basically put it in, it basically fails over time. Or you're putting in a battery for frequency reg, and they don't have enough time on it, and they change the signal that you're going to be following, and the batteries all fail. I think that is more important than actually a big shift in how batteries are going to change. I think right using a battery is more important today than basically what's going to come in the near future.
So I'm hearing scale and integration into, as we feel the edges of the thing, basically.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And in addition, is what Darren was mentioning, is the right application for the right battery, right? And how could I explain it? So basically, we have the technology. It's how we're going to be utilizing it and what will be the business model behind it. You were mentioning right now, well, I can put a battery for 7 years or for 14 years and oversize it. Now, the innovation, the business model is something called augmentation. Let's say, for example, I install this battery for 7 years, and I'm going to accept a 10% degradation on the battery, and once I hit that point, I'm going to add more cells to the battery to replenish the capacity up to the 100% for the year first of the 7. And you are extending your asset life and minimizing the cost, as the cost curve of the batteries are going to continue to decrease because of scale, because of demand, because of technology improvements. And that, it would give you an extra benefit. So you are not investing your capital extensively on year 1, but you are planningly accordingly. And once again, and in order to do that, it's important to understand the interactions between those and model your system.
Great. Well, I think we're ready for Q&A. What time is it? Yeah. Does anybody have questions? Okay, there's one right down here. Oh, you've got the roving mic. Awesome. Yeah, there you go.
So, hello? Okay. So I'm asking this from an investor point of view. You know, if keep it very simple, if I were to want to invest in, say, a fast charging site, and then thinking about adding batteries on top, what I'm hearing from from you guys is that you're basically having two cost savings. You have the savings from the arbitrage of the demand, and you have the savings from not having to pay for the higher voltage coming from the utility. And on the other side, obviously, you have the cost of the battery themselves. And so the question is, without any incentives from the utilities to lower the cost of the battery, is there an ROI?
It really depends on your utility tariff. And I know that's a not very satisfactory answer, but every time we look at it, it's a site-by-site cases, and we take site-by-site basis, and we take a look at the demand charges, the energy arbitrage opportunities to figure out whether that makes sense, absent any other utility incentives.
Okay.
Yeah, I would add it is, you know, the arbitrage, but then also the evolving rates or rebates you're going to get from them. So sometimes you'll go to the utility and say, I'm thinking about a 50 kWh battery, but they're willing to fund the extra 200 to make it accessible to them or usable to them in the market. So it's really utility by utility and what they're looking to invest in, how familiar they are with the battery solution so far.
That's where the IRA might come in as well, like if you install batteries in specific communities, but go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say one thing that has to go into this calculus about whether or not putting a battery on site works is to really understand how that changes your risk profile. Because introducing a battery into a system like this will increase the risk. And you need to be able to convince yourself that that risk is worth the investment, then that you're going to make it back. And this is real risk, right? I mean, these things can get very angry if something bad happens. So it's going to be very important going forward to really critically analyze whether or not you need a battery in that location and what you're going to get from that battery if you put it in that location, and what it might cost you if you put it in that location.
Yeah, real quick here. You mentioned the return on investment. I mean, if without the incentive from the utility, is there any ROI? And as he mentioned, it depends, right? And it's how you can stack the different values. And different utilities, different states, they may have different programs. And what will be the use case of that battery? If it's to recharge a fleet of vehicles, can you apply for the the low carbon fuel standard, or any other type of incentive program that is outside the utility, but it would be more related to the fuel consumption or carbon credits, right? It all depends.
I was wondering what you thought about the future of flow batteries being used on a utility scale to provide large-scale energy storage.
Yeah, flow batteries, I think, are going to make a difference in the near term. They are closer to ready for prime time than the other emerging battery technologies out there. There's some viable smaller scale examples that are in use right now. It's largely a plumbing issue, and really smart engineers are working on those problems right now. The electrochemistry is all worked out. It's just keeping the thing alive long enough to make it useful for a deployed application.
It's really all about applications. It's where you're going to put the battery, how you're going to use it, and what you're going to use it for. A flow battery, the government loves a flow battery because they can deploy that thing out in the front, and basically the bladder, or however big is the amount of fluid, will run your amount of time. And it does have its uses, but the worst thing is when a customer tries to use the wrong battery in the wrong application. So a flow battery, like in a frequency reg market, will not work.
All right, we got about 9 minutes left. I got 3 guys and try to squeeze yours in, so let's get these last in as quick as possible.
So this is Burak. I am coming from E.ON, so from a utility. I'm not working in E.ON anymore, but we have tried all of these solutions. So we try to integrate the batteries with the chargers, with the DC fast chargers. For the DC fast chargers that are already there, we integrated batteries. So it doesn't work because while you're selling your electricity to the EV owners at 40 cents per kilowatt hour, when you apply arbitrage, you're not making that money. Basically, you are losing money when you are not selling it to the EV owners. So that is not bringing any ROI. So you have to focus on that. And what we have seen is that microgrids are the solution for this, but as long as you take them off grid. So that's why we came up with the solution with 2 of my colleagues. And we install fully off-grid DC fast chargers that are powered by solar panels in the form of carports that we install into open parking spaces. So rather than selling it to the grid with 3 cents per kilowatt hour or 10 cents per kilowatt hour, we are charging with 45 or 50 cents. So that's making money. And the internal rate of return of these stations are around 20%, which is impossible to get with any charging station today or with even solar panels. So basically, it is increasing the revenues that you're coming in. So you have to focus on niche, that what we've seen, and you have to build a market around that you can scale. So we are now installing our chargers to basically every open parking lot in California, in Florida. And that is limiting our operations. We're not 24/7 operational charging station, but we are focused on daytime. But daytime is where 95% of the charging operation happens all the time. So it is making money, but people need to focus on niche. It's just like, should I invest in DC fast chargers and then integrate the battery? No, you have to integrate the battery from the beginning, and you have to come up with a standardized product so you cannot tailor-made it and increase the cost coming in. So that's what we see, and hopefully it will work. Yeah.
Any comment to that?
I think that confirms the planning and knowing your use case and understanding what the value is. It's a great utility perspective. Yep.
Maybe what I would just say is the arbitrage there is not saying I'm not going to charge vehicles and instead use the battery. It's more about saying, let me charge during low cost of electricity times. And when I'm charging other vehicles, I'm discharging it so I don't have to pull from the grid.
I think the most important thing that you said was to understand what the problem is and deploy the right solution, right? And that's kind of what we've been talking about up here.
Hi, I'm Vivek Rajmohan from Shell. What considerations should be taken into account when you compare a standalone battery system versus something like a FreeWire, something integrated with a charger, while designing a site? And a second question is, what's the role of an energy management system in all of this, right?
I think the nice thing about FreeWire is it's an all-in-one solution, and we just install that rather than dealing with 2 separate pieces of equipment and having to have knowledge of both chargers and battery management systems. If someone was there and able to manage that whole process for us, that'd be good. But oftentimes we're moving so quickly, we need something that agile.
And I think for the larger ones or where there's multiple, the energy management system comes into play with a microgrid controller. If you put a microgrid controller in there, it really opens up the flexibility of all those DERs and being able to operate those, whether it's charging the vehicle, taking the price point from the solar, the price input from the utility in the market, and understanding all those drivers and knowing which energy source is going to be your lowest cost option at the time.
That's right. And enhance that with I don't know if there is any EMS, energy management system, that would integrate with a structure of tariff in order to make the best decision when it's more, attractive to charge or utilize those type of assets and have a bi-directional connection with the utility in order to maximize your systems.
The other one is your EMS system is also there for basically your safety side of your battery. You want to be able to say we don't want to discharge below a certain level and we don't want to overcharge. So that EMS is also from a safety aspect to basically ensure that the battery lasts as long as possible, but at the same point in time you don't have a mishap on that battery.
Hi, as has been discussed, one of the drivers for installing energy storage at an EV charging station is where the utility distribution infrastructure is either inadequate or non-existent in a particular site, or the customer service drop was sized for, pretty modest loads. If you're talking about even an entry-level fast charging station, you're talking at least several hundred, maybe up to a megawatt of peak load. So I'm interested in what are we comparing it to? If you take a EV charging station with no storage, what would be rough order of magnitude cost of bringing, say, a 500 kilowatt or 1 megawatt service to a particular site, or upgrading it if it doesn't exist?
I don't have an answer to that question. I'm just a scientist. I just work here.
I think from a fleet perspective, the issue is not so much the cost, because the utility will usually cover that. It's the timelines. So your cost is basically not operating for the time that you're waiting for the utility to bring power in.
Yeah, I'd say I can't answer the cost upgrade question, but I know from the perspective of if you're in a place where there is large fleets going in and your infrastructure isn't enabled for that, odds are that is already on their integrated development plan or their upgrade plan. But when it lands within their plan and when they're actually going to upgrade that, by you approaching them and asking that you want to add a battery, that may expedite it and help with a lot of those costs going into that distribution network.
That's right. I think that would be one way to accelerate your project. Most of the time, the limitation is on the hosting capacity for that new load. And if you can add the batteries in order to increase that ability to charge multiple cars, for example, with the existing infrastructure, that might be possible on that end, utilizing a battery to enhance the limited system that you may have. The other thing that you would need to understand is the utilization. I mean, how often that event will happen. I mean, how likely is it? I mean, it's important to understand that as well.
The other one that does come into play is if you have something like PV, you want to basically take and shift that PV energy. The battery works out very well to do that for you and shift it to the time that you're actually doing the charging.
I guess I'll just throw out there that if there are any fleets out there trying to figure out how to solve similar challenges, I'm sure, I don't want to speak for you guys, but I imagine we're all happy to talk with you.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we're out of time. So I want to thank the panel, Matt, Darren, Kevin, Daniel, Eduardo. Thank you for sharing your valuable information with us this afternoon.